In the spring of 1945, the skies over Europe finally fell silent. There was no longer the drone of bomber engines, the sound of artillery, or the ear-piercing wail of air raid sirens. Yet this silence was not one of peace, but a heavy and cold stillness born of immense destruction. For 6 years, the Second World War had ravaged the continent, claiming millions of lives and wiping cities off the map. Berlin, Warsaw, Rotterdam, Dresden, and the East End of London had been reduced to rubble. As far as the eye could see, gray mounds of debris, charred wooden beams, and toppled concrete blocks stretched out, with people struggling to survive not in a new era of peace, but in the midst of the wreckage. By the war's end, around 40 million people had been displaced. Train stations, truck beds, temporary camps, and abandoned factories had become shelters for the homeless. Agricultural production had all but ceased. Fields were littered with mines, tractors lay in scrap heaps, and farmers had either perished on the front lines or returned home maimed. Basic foods like bread, milk, and meat were rationed, with black market prices soaring to astronomical levels. A family might wait for hours in line just to receive their weekly bread. Industry lay in ruins, railways and bridges destroyed, ports inoperable, and even when factories stood intact, there was no raw material to feed them. Currency values plummeted, and in some countries wages could no longer cover the price of basic food. On top of the physical devastation, the war had left deep social scars. Millions of children were orphaned, villages had lost nearly all their male population, and people lived in an atmosphere where trust was scarce. Under these conditions, Europe's recovery on its own seemed impossible. A helping hand from across the Atlantic would soon alter the course of history. As one of the victors, the United States had not experienced the destruction of war on its own soil. Instead, its war economy had propelled its industry to the peak. It now possessed the world's strongest economy, the largest gold reserves, and the most powerful army in history. The other victor, the Soviet Union, had lost about 27 million people and seen its western regions devastated, yet the Red Army had marched into Berlin, defeating Nazi Germany and establishing dominance over Eastern Europe. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany soon fell under Soviet influence, sowing the seeds of the division that Churchill would call the Iron Curtain. The ruined economy of post-war Europe and the despair of its people provided fertile ground for the spread of communism, a development that alarmed strategists in Washington. They feared, if Europe cannot recover, Soviet influence could spread across the entire continent. In 1947, President Truman announced the Truman Doctrine before Congress, pledging U.S. support to nations threatened by communism. Greece and Turkey were the first to receive aid. For the United States, however, the issue was not only ideological but also economic and strategic. Reviving European markets would boost American exports, build a strong Western bloc loyal to the U.S., and contain Soviet influence. By 1946, Churchill's Iron Curtain speech had made it clear that U.S.-Soviet relations had soured, replacing wartime alliance with a long, tense rivalry. Washington was now preparing a massive project to rebuild Europe and strengthen the West, a project that would go down in history as the Marshall Plan, one that would change not only Europe's fate but also the course of global politics. Faced with the sheer scale of destruction caused by the Second World War, the United States clearly understood that Europe could not recover on its own. By 1947, serious debates were taking place in Washington over a massive aid program that would revive the continent. Amid these discussions, U.S. Secretary of State George C. Marshall delivered a historic speech on June 5, 1947, at Harvard University's commencement ceremony. From the podium, Marshall was not merely sending a diplomatic message, he was announcing the most important economic strategy of the post-war era. In his speech, he described Europe's disastrous condition in stark detail, stressing that both its economies and societies had collapsed entirely, and that an urgent, comprehensive aid plan was essential for the continent's future. Marshall's words were direct and striking. The recovery of Europe is essential not only for the well-being of millions of people, but also for the continuation of world peace. This assistance must be given not in piecemeal fashion, but within the framework of a coordinated and large-scale plan. This proposal would later become official under the name European Recovery Program, but in the public eye and in history it would be known as the Marshall Plan. The plan involved not just financial assistance, but also long-term goals such as increasing production, revitalizing trade, and modernizing industrial and agricultural infrastructure. At first, the United States decided to offer aid not only to Western European countries but to all of Europe, including the Soviet Union. At least in theory, the aim was to raise the prosperity of the entire continent. However, the Soviets rejected the proposal, viewing it as an attempt by the US to expand its economic and political influence, and they even prevented their Eastern European satellite states from participating. Thus, from the outset, the Marshall Plan drew an ideological dividing line. It would strengthen Western Europe economically, while Eastern Europe remained within the Soviet bloc. Washington embarked on meticulous preparations for implementing the plan, with months of debate in the US Congress. Criticism arose as well. Some lawmakers argued that such a heavy financial burden would harm American taxpayers, while others claimed Europe could not recover without making its own efforts. The Truman administration, however, continually emphasized that this aid was not only a humanitarian responsibility, but also a strategic investment that would limit Soviet influence and bring long-term economic benefits to the United States. Finally, in the spring of 1948, the Marshall Plan was officially launched, with 16 Western European countries joining the program. Thus began the most comprehensive peacetime aid project in history, opening a new chapter in Europe's rebirth. When the Marshall Plan officially went into effect in the spring of 1948, the scale and complexity of the program were unprecedented. To organize and distribute the aid effectively, the United States established a special agency called the Economic Cooperation Administration, ECA, headed by the experienced businessman Paul G. Hoffman. The ECA acted as a bridge between Washington and European capitals, ensuring that aid was directed not merely as financial transfers, but toward projects that would boost production and revitalize trade. The 16 countries participating in the program submitted detailed annual reports to the ECA outlining their economic needs, production capacities, and investment priorities. Aid allocations were then determined based on these reports. The largest share went to the countries most severely affected by the war. The United Kingdom received approximately $3.3 billion, France, $2.3 billion, West Germany, $1.4 billion, and Italy, $1.2 billion. The Netherlands, Belgium, Greece, Austria, and others received smaller but vital amounts. In total, between 1948 and 1952, the Marshall Plan transferred $13.2 billion to Europe, equivalent to hundreds of billions of dollars in today's terms. However, the aid did not come solely in cash. A large portion consisted of agricultural machinery, industrial equipment, construction materials, fuel, medicine, and food. This helped rebuild destroyed railways, modernize ports, install new machinery in factories, and bring tractors to fields. The program also encouraged cooperation among European nations. The OEEC, Organization for European Economic Cooperation, created to coordinate the aid, would later become one of the foundations of the European Economic Community and ultimately the European Union. The assistance not only revitalized economies but also directly improved people's daily lives. Rationing systems were phased out, store shelves began to fill, unemployment rates declined, and housing construction accelerated. For the United States, the program both helped Western Europe resist communist influence and created a massive market for American goods, since a significant portion of the aid consisted of US-produced equipment and supplies. In this way, the Marshall Plan became a unique combination of humanitarian aid and strategic interest. Just a few years after the Marshall Plan began to be implemented, Europe's economic landscape began to show visible signs of transformation. Cities that were still struggling amid rubble in 1948 had been revitalized by 1952, factory chimneys were smoking again, and the sounds of construction cranes had replaced the echoes of war. Thanks to the plan, Western European economies achieved average annual growth rates of up to 15%, agricultural production rose above pre-war levels, and industrial output doubled. In the United Kingdom, coal and steel production surged. In France, modern highway and railway projects were launched, and in West Germany, the era of the Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle, began, with factories in the Ruhr region reopening and the country quickly becoming Europe's industrial engine. In Italy, agricultural reforms and industrial investments helped reduce the gap between North and South, while in the Netherlands, the port of Rotterdam regained its position as the heart of European trade. Marshall aid also produced tangible improvements in people's daily lives. Long bread lines shortened, rationing systems were abolished, store shelves began to fill, and wages rose. Unemployment declined as millions found work again, and new homes, schools, and hospitals were constructed. Yet the effects of the plan were not solely economic. Hope, confidence, and a sense of stability began to grow once more in Western European societies. This shift also influenced politics. The post-war rise in support for communist parties began to decline as economic recovery took hold, especially in France and Italy. The Marshall Plan further fostered economic cooperation among Western European nations, paving the way for a common market. The work of the OEEC facilitated the removal of trade barriers, the development of joint projects, and more efficient use of resources. For the United States, the plan did not merely create a stable economic zone loyal to Washington. It also helped pave the way for NATO's formation and strengthened the Western Bloc as one of the first major strategic moves of the Cold War. Officially ending in 1952, the Marshall Plan left behind a modernizing, industrially strengthened, and more prosperous Western Europe instead of a war-weary, devastated continent. For this reason, many historians consider it the most successful economic aid program of the 20th century. The economic impact of the Marshall Plan was profound, but its political consequences were equally decisive, as the program effectively established one of the first major fronts of the Cold War. Initially, the United States had offered aid to all of Europe. However, the Soviet Union categorically rejected the plan, labeling it economic imperialism, and pressured its Eastern European satellite states not to participate. This stance accelerated the division of Europe into two distinct economic and political blocs. While Western European countries entered a process of economic recovery with Marshall aid, Eastern European nations, under Moscow's control, created their own closed economic sphere through the centrally planned Comecon, Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, system. This division was not limited to economics. Political institutions, foreign policy choices, and security strategies also diverged. Western European countries, strengthened by growing economic ties with the United States, sought collective security, a process that culminated in the establishment of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in 1949. The birth of NATO was not merely a defensive alliance against the Soviet military threat, but also part of the institutionalization of the Western Bloc initiated by the Marshall Plan. Western Europe, revitalized with Marshall aid, also became militarily aligned under U.S. leadership, a development that, in Moscow's eyes, confirmed that the plan's true purpose was more than just economic assistance. The Soviets claimed that American cultural influence was spreading throughout Western Europe, asserting that the plan had facilitated the adoption of US-style lifestyles in areas ranging from cinema to newspapers. Indeed, in the newspapers of the time, American machinery, tractors, and steel products were as much symbols of Marshall aid as Hollywood films and jazz music. In this way, the Marshall Plan not only reshaped Europe's post-war economic map but also drew its ideological boundaries. Long before the Berlin Wall, an invisible, Iron Curtain, had already been erected across the continent. Although the Marshall Plan is considered by many historians to be one of the most successful economic aid programs of the 20th century, it has also faced various criticisms from the period of its implementation to the present day. The first group of critics argued that, under the guise of humanitarian and economic assistance, the plan primarily served U.S. political and economic interests. According to this view, recipient countries became dependent not only economically but also politically on Washington, having to align their foreign policy decisions with the Western Bloc's agenda. Some scholars emphasized that much of the aid was tied, meaning that the goods sent were largely produced in the United States, thereby creating a vast market for American industry. In Soviet and Eastern Bloc propaganda, the Marshall Plan was portrayed as economic occupation and conquest through soft power, with particular emphasis on the offer to Eastern Europe being a maneuver to corner the Soviets and shrink their sphere of influence. Some criticisms from within the West focused on the financial scale of the program. Certain members of Congress argued that the $13.2 billion in aid imposed a burden on U.S. taxpayers and could have been spent on domestic issues instead. Additionally, some economists contended that Europe's recovery was driven primarily not by the Marshall Plan but by the natural post-war reconstruction process, technological advancements, and the expansion of global trade. In their view, the plan accelerated growth that was already underway but did not create it on its own. Nonetheless, beyond these opposing views, rejecting Marshall aid was almost impossible for Western European governments at the time. In the face of post-war shortages, unemployment, and political instability, The resources provided both economic and psychological lifelines. Therefore, while debates over the plan's motivations and long-term consequences continue, the relief and stability it brought to Europe in those years remain undeniable. Today, the Marshall Plan is remembered not only as an economic aid program that rebuilt post-war Europe but also as a prototype for modern international development policies. Initiatives ranging from the World Bank to the United Nations Development Program, and from regional aid funds to bilateral economic agreements, drew on the logic of the Marshall Plan. That economic assistance should combine financial transfers with infrastructure investment, increased production capacity, and the strengthening of political stability. Even today, when large-scale economic support projects are proposed, media and political circles often refer to them as a new Marshall Plan, demonstrating the enduring power of the plan in public memory. In Europe, the Marshall Plan is recalled as the beginning of long-term relations with the United States, a turning point that accelerated European integration, and the economic cornerstone of the West throughout the Cold War. Regardless of criticisms, its symbolic meaning remains strong, a story of hope rising from destruction, reconstruction emerging from scarcity. More than 70 years later, the aid sent during that period directly affected the lives of millions of people on the continent, illuminating a path out of the darkest days of the war. Today, the legacy of the Marshall Plan lives on not only in numbers but also in transformed cityscapes, modernized infrastructure, and a shared European identity. And so, we have reached the end of the story of the Marshall Plan, one of the most critical elements in Europe's rebirth from the ashes of World War II. If you enjoyed this narrative and want to continue exploring such detailed journeys through history, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and turn on notifications. Share your thoughts and questions in the comments section, and we'll see you again on the next journey through history. Goodbye.